With a ferocity that changed nations and destroyed people, the Second World War ripped through Europe. Millions of people were displaced, farms burned, and cities lay in ruins. German women were among the innumerable displaced, and by 1943, they were taken prisoner of war. They were transported over the enormous Atlantic to the far-off and strange country of the United States, not east into Soviet camps or imprisoned in the devastated heart of Germany. Their voyage was unlike any other. Both necessity and strategy led to the decision to move captives from Europe to America. As conflicts shifted against the Reich, Allied commanders had to deal with the problem of sheltering an increasing number of prisoners. Tens of thousands of German soldiers came from North Africa, Sicily, and eventually Italy. While males constituted the bulk of these soldiers, women, nurses, auxiliary personnel, and members of military support services became more and more prevalent. The United States provided space, food, and protection while bombings and resource shortages put Britain under duress. Transports started heading west in the middle of 1943, bringing groups of women, many of whom were still in their 20s, along with Wehrmacht soldiers. The actual journey was a harsh lesson. The sight of the American convoys was overpowering to ladies who had only ever known devastation and scarcity. Guarded by aircraft and warships larger than anything Germany could still deploy, troopships crossed under heavy escort. Although submarine assaults were still a possibility, the Battle of the Atlantic had changed the tide. The use of sonar, radar, and long-range patrol planes increased the security of crossings. As entire ships moved with abundance and order, German prisoners stood on packed decks and watched in amazement. There was no more striking contrast than the blasted harbors of Hamburg or the dilapidated docks of Bremen. The impression was strengthened upon arrival on American soil. Before being taken interior, prisoners disembarked in ports like Norfolk, Boston, and New York. They were escorted by armed guards on sealed carriages. Yet even behind barbed wire, they saw a glimpse of a nation that had not yet been devastated. Towns were teeming with people going about their daily lives. Industries belched smoke of production rather than devastation, and farm fields stretched uninterrupted. This was the first direct experience of the vast resources of the United States for women who had grown up in war-torn Europe. The size and location of the camps varied. Many were founded in the Midwest, Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, which are rural heartlands with enough of room for barracks and are remote from coastal threats. The women experienced an abrupt and confusing change. They discovered tidy compounds with wooden homes, canteens, and infirmaries in place of streets littered with debris. Although living conditions were far from comfortable, American authorities generally followed the Geneva Convention's requirements for humane treatment. Rations appeared plentiful in comparison to domestic shortages. Regular appearances of bread, pork, and even coffee demonstrated the extent of America's wartime prosperity. There was symbolic significance to the presence of German women prisoners of war. Local populations were curious and occasionally uneasy about the unexpected arrival of female captives. However, reports indicate that the majority of encounters were restricted and governed by camp rules and military discipline. The psychological toll of being held captive in a strange nation was borne by the women themselves, who were cut off from their family and homeland. Some quickly adjusted, participating in camp labor programs or picking up a few words of English. Others retreated, finding it difficult to balance their allegiance to a lost cause with the truth of their situation. From a strategic standpoint, these transfers kept possible disturbances away from the front and reduced pressure on Europe. By keeping captives in America, the Allies gained leverage for any swaps and ensured that they could not return to combat. But for the women, survival was more important than strategy. Every day behind the wire was a day away from the advancing front lines, hunger, and air raids. They were shocked by the disparities in treatment, according to historical accounts. Medical personnel who treated wounds without question, guards who maintained discipline but rarely showed violence, and a society that was monetarily secure while being their adversary. They remembered the contrast between destruction and plenty. Life throughout Europe was characterized by scarcity. Food was rationed, clothing was patched and repatched until it was threadbare, and coal was limited. In America, the inmates saw industries making both consumer goods and weaponry, trains arriving on time, and farms bursting with harvests. The abundance could be seen even inside the camps. Red Cross packages complemented daily meals, uniforms were routinely cleaned, and kitchens were supplied with supplies in amounts unimaginable under the Reich. It was confusing and humbling to ladies who had witnessed bombing attacks and crumbling infrastructure. Captivity, however, was hardly paradise. Watchtowers threw long shadows, barbed wire surrounded their world, and the awareness of being far from home was a heavy burden. Letters were controlled, sent slowly, and frequently delayed for months. There were rumors of bombings in Berlin, of Eastern Front setbacks, and of lost or displaced families. Weeks turned into years, and the mental pressure increased. Many came to the conclusion that they would not win the war and that their lives depended on an outcome that was out of their control. Groups developed inside the camps. Some adhered to certain ideologies, while others only wanted to survive until they were released. What these transfers disclosed about world power was what gave them their greater significance. America proved its unparalleled capacity by taking in so many inmates. The United States had adequate resources to host and feed its adversaries thousands of miles away while fighting across 2 oceans and maintaining forces overseas. The experience served as a real-life lesson on resource imbalance for German women prisoners of war. Their voyage represented more than just loss. It demonstrated how the war was driven by geographic security and economic might. These women stayed behind American gates while the war continued, seeing the seasons change while Europe burned. Their thoughts, later documented in memoirs and reports, were more about contrasts than battles. The quiet of Midwestern nights versus the roar of bombings, the flavor of food untarnished by rationing, and the feeling of security even in captivity. Many people first became aware of the extent of America's involvement in the war here, on the other side of the world, which seemed endless in comparison to the devastated country they had left behind. The tale of how they got there was just the start. The everyday realities of camp life, routines, limitations, and unanticipated insights into American society were beyond the initial shock of plenty. The following chapter takes place there, amid the barbed wire and the changing seasons. It had merely been the start of the Atlantic voyage. When the captured women first saw American ports, they saw a world unaffected by conflict. Their tale, however, did not stop at the water's edge. They boarded guarded trains from the ports and traveled far into the American heartland to reach the compounds that would become their new home. They were astounded by the size of the journey across the ocean as they were by the comfort of being in the heartland of America. The train move was well planned. Women sat in automobiles that were closed off to the outside world, watched by armed guards. In and of themselves, the vast expanses of farmland that passed past their windows conveyed a tale. The American Midwest rolled with intact fields, whereas Europe's soil was marred by trenches and bomb craters. Barns remained intact, crops flourished in order, and tiny towns were teeming with civilian activity. The world war that was occurring elsewhere didn't seem to have affected this environment. According to other tales, the inmates were so taken aback by the normalcy they witnessed that they became silent. The trains halted at camps strewn throughout states like Texas, Kansas, and Iowa after days of travel. These locations were purposefully placed. They provided open areas for construction while maintaining security, far from any coast. The enclosures were clearly prisons, ringed with guard towers and fenced by barbed wire. However, the harsh austerity that many had expected was not what was within. Rows of wooden barracks existed, vented against the summer and heated against the cold. Running water was used to maintain the restrooms. Medical supplies and beds were available in infirmaries. These amenities were remarkably adequate in comparison to the crumbling conditions of wartime Germany. Initial impressions persisted. Clean bedding, consistent lighting, and working stoves were almost unreal to ladies used to a life of scarcity. Later, some noted that the most startling feature was the availability of hot water, which was so uncommon in their bomb-ravaged country that even hospitals frequently lacked it. They discovered functional baths, kitchens with standard supplies, and dispensaries where American doctors quietly and effectively treated illness within complexes designed to house them. Inside the compounds, daily activities had a routine. Guards regulated mobility, mealtimes were scheduled, and roll calls were rigorous. However, the women found conditions that were far different from what they had anticipated within those parameters. Despite being basic, rations were always the same. Tables featured meat, bread, and vegetables, perhaps accompanied by coffee and canned foods. For a lot of them, it was the first time in years that they could eat without worrying about shortages. Barracks were kept warm throughout the Midwestern winters by heating systems, and medical personnel made sure that illness outbreaks, which were so frequent in camps in Europe, were quickly managed. The inmates were aware of the difference. The Geneva Convention was strictly adhered to by American authorities. Records indicate that even minor complaints were occasionally resolved, and inspections were carried out to uphold standards. The goal was pragmatic, maintaining law and order and proving that the U.S. fulfilled its commitments. However, the impact was significant for the women. The way they were treated was very different from what they had been told about enemy captivity. They found a systematic but compassionate system that appeared to be based on plenty rather than harshness and neglect. It emphasized a reality they were unable to deny. America had the material resources to care for its prisoners in addition to the military might to prevail in conflicts. The psychological effects were multifaceted. Since they were still incarcerated and apart from their families, the word gratitude was inappropriate. They had to deal with lengthy delays, censored letters, and constant uncertainty. But surprise turned to introspection. The barracks served as tangible representations of the two countries' differences. Children in Germany scrounged for coal, hospitals were short on medicine, and families hid in cellars to protect themselves from air raids. Even enemy detainees in America slept in heated quarters with access to health care. It was an imbalance of resources rather than strategy. The towns around the camps kept a wary eye on things. The unexpected appearance of German women surrounded by barbed wire was a mystery to many living in rural Texas or Iowa. Although inmates were occasionally mentioned in local publications, there was little engagement. By keeping people at bay, military regulations made sure that fences and watchtowers characterized the women's world. Even still, the fact that they were able to live in safety while war was still raging elsewhere said a lot about America's ability to fight a war on a global scale without losing its own territory. The compounds served their objective strategically. They eased the strain on Allied logistics overseas by removing thousands of prisoners from the European theater. They supplied labor that might be used for maintenance or other non-military tasks like farming. Additionally, they sent a message to the world that the United States could effectively support both its own military and its detainees, unlike its enemies. Even though the women were unaware of it at the time, their surprise at the facilities represented the war's larger reality. Industrial might determined endurance just as much as military triumphs. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months for the inmates themselves. The impression of that first encounter was etched in memory, but the novelty of arrival gave way to the monotony of regularity. Small elements that conveyed a country where scarcity was not the norm were the sound of hot water running in pipes, the warmth of radiators in the winter, and the smell of disinfectant in medical rooms. Those details served as reminders of a larger reality for women who had been accustomed to deprivation. America fought from a position of strength so immense that even its camps bore the burden of industrial superiority. Questions remained as they adapted to their new reality. How long would they stay? What would come in from home? And what part, if any, would they play in a conflict that seemed to be getting farther away yet still decided their destiny? Within the Midwest's boundaries, these women found themselves in a precarious situation. Prisoners in a strange country, but observers of a degree of security that their native country was no longer able to offer. Their journey to the compounds was a beginning rather than a conclusion. The greater difficulty of life in captivity, routine, labor, and the gradual passing of years, lay beyond the shock of clean water and heated chambers. Within the daily routines of the camps, the next chapter takes place. The women were soon exposed to something even more startling than the railway compounds where they had initially seen the scope of American incarceration. After a lengthy and eerie trek into the interior of the camps, they were confronted with a revelation that affected them more profoundly than barbed wire, watchtowers, or the soldiers' constant presence. Many of them experienced the unbounded flow of water for the first time in their lives here, behind simple wooden doors. What these ladies had experienced in their towns and villages throughout war-torn Europe was very different from the communal facilities found inside the American enclosures. By the middle of the 1940s, shortages and bombing had caused Germany's infrastructure to collapse. Many homes relied on buckets filled from public pumps, which were occasionally guarded or rationed by officials, while pipes and water mains were damaged. Even more scarce was hot water, which frequently required wood or coal that could not be spared. The sight of unbroken plumbing was nearly unbelievable to those traveling from towns like Hamburg or Cologne, where entire neighborhoods had been destroyed. Conditions within the Midwestern states of Iowa, Texas, and others were far from luxury by American standards. The walls were flimsy against winter winds, the barracks was basic, and the regulations of confinement were strict. However, the facilities provided a degree of consistency and hygiene not seen in previous years in contrast to the destruction left in Germany. The walls were lined with sinks, each with a faucet that, when a handle was turned, would generate either warm or cold water. Rows of showers, their pipes linked to reliable municipal infrastructure, flowed steadily. For the inmates, what could have seemed routine to the American guards turned into a moment of extreme confusion. According to camp staff reports, many women were first wary, even suspicious of these showers. Some people walked up to the faucets as though they were expecting them to break, anticipating a sudden cutoff or rust-colored water. Rather, a continuous stream of hot, pure water filled the air with steam. Stunned not just by the availability of hot water but also by its quantity, the inmates stood silently. Baths had been short and rare in Germany, usually lasting only a few inches in a tub that was used by several family members. Some experienced the unbroken torrent of water rushing over them for the first time here. Long before the conflict, the U.S. had made significant infrastructure investments. Wells and municipal systems provided water to residences, public buildings, and schools even in rural areas. The same systems stretched behind the barbed wire in the prisoner compounds. Using reservoirs and treatment facilities that had not been damaged by enemy bombs, pipes were linked to neighboring towns. Despite their austerity, the camps were connected to the very core of American modernity, an infrastructure that Germans living in waste and rations could not fathom. The experience was extremely conflicting for the women. On the one hand, they were deprived of their freedom and kept as prisoners in a strange country. In contrast, a glimpse of life was being offered to them, highlighting the stark differences between the two warring nations. Hot flowing water was more than just a convenience. It was a sign of stability and resources that Germany no longer had. This minor, everyday fact revealed a great deal about the greater power dynamics influencing the fight. Almost immediately, camp medical staff reported improvements in hygiene. Frequent showers stopped the lice and illnesses that had afflicted Europe during the war from spreading. There were fewer incidences of stomach and skin diseases when people had access to clean sinks. The guards saw inmates acclimating rapidly, some welcoming the routine with relief, others remaining silently uneasy, as if the pattern's simplicity only served to emphasize how much had been lost back home. Either way, the water's movement came to represent both solace and imprisonment. According to several accounts, inmates discussed with one another the nearly unfathomable contrast between their current circumstances and the suffering they had experienced in the past. Families in German communities that had been blasted out had to wait hours to fill one bucket. Water flowed at the touch of a hand here, in enemy custody. They did not miss the irony. It turned into one of the numerous reminders that the war was being waged not just on actual battlefields but also in the areas of infrastructure, logistics, and resources. Even those who were imprisoned were suddenly feeling the effects of America's plenty. These facilities have an effect that went beyond their local surroundings. Reliable sanitation was seen by the American authorities as a question of both international law compliance and public health. Access to water was a component of the humane treatment mandated by the Geneva Conventions. However, the United States also showed its inmates a facet of its own industrial power and structure in the process. The unending showers and spotless sinks turned into daily teachings about the strength of a country that had not seen domestic devastation. These initial meetings remained in the women's memories. Their arrival in America was most clearly remembered by the shock of the never-ending torrent of water, not by the towers, the soldiers, or even the barbed wire. The sound of pipes humming in the walls conveyed a message they could not ignore, and the warmth of their skin stood in stark contrast to the cold of rationed basins in Germany. Evidence of a more secure and stable world than the one they had left behind could be seen here, even in the constraints of captivity. The baths became a regular occurrence as the days stretched into weeks, a part of camp life's everyday routine. However, the surprise of those initial meetings was never completely forgotten. For many, it represented the sharp contrast between two realities of war: a nation in ruins from bombardment and a land of wealth that appeared to be overflowing with resources, even in prison. This revelation set them up for more shocks that awaited them within the camps, comforts and systems that kept surprising them. The emphasis moves further into these encounters in the ensuing chapters, when the inmates would have to deal with running water as well as the even more perplexing existence of contemporary American bathing systems, which were built on a scale that was far larger than anything they could have ever envisioned. The women were even more shocked when they found something even more remarkable than the initial trickle from faucets. The showers continued throughout the camps. As if there were no boundaries, the water flowed continuously, hot and steady. The thought of taking a bath every day seemed nearly unfeasible to individuals who had become used to rationed basins and rushed washings. However, it became a novel and shocking reality within American compounds. The cities of Germany told a different tale. By 1944, Allied bombers had frequently hit Berlin's waterworks. Hamburg had witnessed huge pumping stations fall in flames. In Cologne, under the debris-filled streets, municipal pipes were broken. Even in cases when water could be drawn, heating it required wood or coal, which are now valuable resources frequently saved for the military or industrial. For civilians, particularly women left behind in damaged areas, bathing was an occasional privilege, not a practice. The best they could expect for was a basin of cold water, which was occasionally shared by family members. In light of this, entering an American camp shower block was an absolutely astounding experience. Although the buildings were simple, constructed of concrete and wood, they were immediately linked to operational municipal infrastructure. According to reports, the walls were lined with rows of shower heads, each of which released a powerful, continuous flow. Inmates warily moved closer, anticipating that the water would splutter and eventually dissipate, but this was not the case. Warm and pure, it flowed incessantly, filling the chamber with rising clouds of steam. According to some guard reports, the women at first rationed the showers out of habit and utilized them sparingly. They hurried as if they were afraid the flow might stop or that there were other people waiting with buckets that were empty. But as days passed, they found that there was no shortage. The water never dried up. Over time, taking a bath became a daily ritual rather than a last-minute necessity. Even if they were relieved, many were subtly uneasy after the jolt. The United States had entered the war with resources on a scale Germany could not equal. Industries prospered, infrastructure held firm, and civilian utilities carried on with little interference. In the camps, this meant that, regardless of bombing or shortage, plumbing systems continuously drew from reservoirs and purification facilities. This abundance was represented by the showers. For the convicts, they showed more than just solace. They showed the difference between a country that was unaffected by destruction and one that was falling. Nearly instantly, medical personnel noticed the advantages. Skin conditions that were common in overcrowded shelters throughout Europe became uncommon. Frequent bathing decreased lice, which were a persistent problem in Germany during the war. The ability to wash every day was cited by camp doctors as one reason for the improvements in overall health. In reality, what appeared to be a straightforward plumbing system was a mirror of broader logistical strength and served as a reminder that America's war effort depended on more than just men and weapons. The steady, unseen engine of contemporary life kept everything going. The women themselves felt conflicted. They had to remember that they were prisoners, distant from home, and that fences and guards restricted their freedom. However, they were always struck by the difference between their life in captivity and the life they had left behind when they walked under the showers. In Germany, fuel was practically non-existent, soap was limited, and water was precious. Here, even as slaves, they were afforded cleanliness and warmth beyond anything their family may experience for months. Long after the initial days, many people continued to be incredulous. According to reports, other inmates muttered about whether this could go on. Would the water suddenly be restricted by the Americans? Would it disappear as suddenly as it had come? However, it never did. One of the most noteworthy aspects of their incarceration was the system's dependability and the daily shower renewals. These subtleties mattered strategically. The U.S. military believed that keeping the camp sanitary was crucial for efficiency and morale in addition to the health of the inmates. Disease outbreaks could spread quickly in confined spaces, endangering both guards and prisoners. Infrastructure, pumps, pipes, and treatment centers that made sure all inmates could wash on a regular basis was the answer. The inmates were unintentionally shown the extent of American industrial capacity by these same measures. The memory of the unending showers kept coming up in the memories that appeared after the war. It was unthinkable in Berlin, Hamburg, or Cologne during those latter years of war for women to confess that they did not believe in washing every day. They saw the showers as a symbol of not only cleanliness but also the contrast between a country that was eroding under fire and one that was safe beyond the oceans, providing plenty even in its jails. It had a significant psychological impact. Not only did they feel clean, but they also understood the extent of the differences between two societies, frequently with silent resignation. The war had not only been fought in the skies or on the battlefield. It had been fought in the stability of utilities, in the uninterrupted distribution of water, power, and resources. In those American camps, each shower became a reminder that Germany's battle was no longer sustainable. The women were accustomed to taking a bath every day as the weeks stretched into months. What was startling at first became commonplace, but it never quite lost its oddness. Many would carry the memory with them for a long time after returning home, serving as a reminder of their time in America and the difference between two different worlds. More potent than words, the unceasing flow of water conveyed a tale of infrastructure, plenty, and the harsh reality of surviving a war. The inmates would then face another discovery after this moment of shock. Beyond the showers itself were sanitary and bathing systems constructed on a scale that was far larger than anything they had ever experienced. The full complexity of American bathing systems, modern designs that left inmates not just shocked but also profoundly uneasy by the abundance of materials arranged before them, will be covered in the next chapter. Just after the shock of continuous rains had subsided, a more subdued realization came to light. What the women discovered next concerned not only water but everything in its immediate vicinity. The goods they were given told a story much bigger than the walls of any camp, and hygiene itself became a symbol of contrast. Every new ritual was significant from the moment they arrived. Soap was distributed frequently rather than infrequently. Towels were clean, folded cloths rather than soiled rags. Without reluctance, sanitary items that were either scarce or non-existent in many German cities by 1944 were distributed. The abundance was confusing to ladies who had come from houses that had been blasted out in Hamburg, Cologne, or Berlin. The industrial pulse of the United States seemed to be embodied in the mere process of washing, drying, and repeating. Keeping clean has been a daily effort during the European War. Sewer systems were broken, water mains were burst, and soap was almost impossible to locate due to Allied bombing assaults. For a meager supply of necessities, citizens in numerous German cities waited in line for hours. The clothing of soldiers at the front were stiff with filth, lice, and fatigue after weeks without appropriate washing. The American strategy in the prisoner of war camps was nearly incomprehensible to those who had experienced this. Along with weapons and trucks, the American military apparatus had also mobilized the comfort infrastructure. Utilizing the strength of the chemical industry as well as the country's oil reserves, American factories produced enormous amounts of soap. Assembly lines that used to make clothes for department stores now produced linens, towels, and sanitary products. The supply of sanitary supplies appeared to be uninterrupted even in the midst of international conflict. It was an implicit message. This was a nation that was supporting life, not just fighting wars. The scale difference was immediately apparent to the German prisoners. According to reports, women stared at unopened soap boxes as though they didn't believe such a large quantity could exist. Scarcity, tiny cakes of fake soap that crumbled in water, passed from family to family, and cherished like bread rations, was linked to many people's recollections of home. Replacements were now distributed in the camps without opposition. Every bar represented more than just cleanliness. It demonstrated an industrial giant's capacity to produce without worrying about a scarcity. Routines started to shift. Inmates discovered that showers were not just provided once a week and that towels were not gathered at the end of each session. The supplies were refilled as though they were endless. Here was an organized structure that never faltered in a world when every German city was scarred by failure. In war stories about tanks and airplanes, hygiene is frequently ignored, creating a perceptual battleground all its own. The shock had multiple levels of significance for the women. Others talked of the embarrassment of discovering that even inmates had better hygienic conditions in America than they did back home. Regaining the capacity to feel clean, to brush their hair without ash and dust, and to wrap themselves in towels free of holes and stains gave others a sense of calm dignity. This smallest of contrasts contained a more comprehensive concept of power. The quiet movement of supplies into the most ordinary nooks and crannies of existence demonstrated industrial strength in addition to aircraft carriers and Sherman tanks. Towels and soap, which were so commonplace in America during peacetime, constituted silent evidence that the U.S. could fight a world war without sacrificing the necessities of civilian life. Those who had previously bought into the illusion of German dominance found great resonance in that message. The repercussions went beyond the boundaries of the camp. The abundance compelled the inmates to consider the nature of contemporary conflict. In a total war, economies demonstrated their resilience in addition to soldiers engaging in combat. In Germany, shortages had left soldiers weak, famished people, and destroyed morale. The sheer volume of sanitary goods available in America demonstrated an apparent infinite capability. It was as much a triumph of supply chains and industries as it was of strategy and weaponry. As days moved to weeks, the routine of soap and towels became accepted, yet the contrast never totally faded. Every spotless bar was accompanied by a silent allusion to the abandoned houses, looted stores, and bare shelves in Germany. The act of entering a clean shower with new supplies became a reminder of what their nation had lost, and what another had accomplished, especially for women who had previously suffered bomb shelters that smelled of smoke and unclean bodies. The recollection of this abundance would eventually stick with them just as vividly as the actual fighting. Families still living in poverty found the accounts of cleanliness in captivity nearly incomprehensible, even for those who made it back home. They frequently remembered the odd, enduring marvel of soap that never ran out and towels that never vanished before the great battles of Normandy or the boom of bombers. These minor things led to a significant insight. America's military effort was characterized by capacity rather than despair. Supplies for hygiene were necessities rather than extravagances. And the most glaring indication of industrial strength was seen in that discrepancy. The inmates realized that what they were holding was more than just a bar of soap. Rather, it was the silent proof of a system that had the capacity to outproduce, outlast, and eventually overpower. The weight of contrast, a mute testament to the strength of supply, brought the hygiene chapter to a close. From this point on, the tour would go even farther into the everyday realities that exposed the gap between nations. America's industrial depth was shown by the profusion of soap and towels, but the contrast really came to life in the cadence of everyday camp life. The American concentration on routine cleanliness appeared almost ceremonial to German women, who were used to the scarcity and devastation of a crumbling homeland. It was a window into a cultural division that extended well beyond the conflict, and it was more than just discipline. Inspections were the first thing every day. Bunks were arranged in rows along the barracks, and order was expected everywhere. Even for inmates, uniformity was important. As they moved slowly along the aisles, American guards, trained to uphold standards in thousands of camps, noting elements that pointed to order and cleanliness. Items were kept neat, bedding was folded, and dust was swept away. For the women, this was similar to what was expected of soldiers, who were expected to be disciplined and clean, not just comfortable. Work responsibilities came next. Prisoners were given agricultural tasks in some camps, such as harvesting crops to help the local war economy. Some worked in maintenance, fixing fences, cleaning buildings, or helping in kitchens. But there was always organization regardless of the task. Meals were scheduled, hours were controlled, and the day itself proceeded according to plan. The constancy was striking in contrast to the anarchy of ration-starved Europe, where routines had crumbled under bombing attacks and ongoing shortages. Schedules for bathing were rigorously followed. Here, inmates were called in groups and showers were scheduled according to a schedule, unlike the unpredictability they had experienced in Germany. The plumbing, driven by America's extensive infrastructure, delivered water without any disruptions. The women's experiences at home during the war, when water pipes had dried up and soap had been a rare luxury, were in stark contrast to the expectation that they would bathe every day, sometimes twice in hotter climates. The cultural divide this exposed was recognized by observers at the time. Cleanliness had frequently suffered as a result of necessity in Germany. As cities were destroyed, families were crammed into cellars, and trains were packed with evacuees, hygiene became less important than survival. Nonetheless, American standards were steady during the conflict. People expected clean clothes, soap, and flowing water. Training soldiers were examined for uniform care, grooming, and bathing in addition to weapons drills. The fact that this was a country that valued cleanliness as a component of its character was shocking to the convicts. The women quickly came to understand that this fascination was not coincidental. Hygiene has long been associated with readiness and health for the U.S. military. Doctrine has been developed by lessons learned in past conflicts where sickness killed more men than guns. American camps during World War II were built with hygienic conditions in mind. Medical checks, washing facilities, and waste systems were all included into everyday living. For Americans, what appeared to be luxury was only a matter of necessity. Nevertheless, there was no denying the emotional impact. Some inmates talked about how humiliating it was to realize that their captors provided better standards than they had experienced in their home cities, even while they were holding them captive. Others felt a grudging admiration after discovering that the everyday rhythms of living, rather than only the machines of war, were used to gauge America's wealth. Washing, shaving, and maintaining a clean appearance became emblems of a civilization that was not shattered by the stress of international conflict. The routines were also important from a strategic standpoint. American officials quelled turmoil by imposing order. Keeping things clean provided structure, and structure lessened hopelessness. Hygiene thus evolved as a covert control mechanism that upheld discipline without the continual use of force. For the German women, participation was not optional, but neither was it demeaning. Rather, it became a part of a setting where adjusting to a new set of expectations was necessary for survival. As news spread, the disparity with Europe only became more pronounced. They were reminded of the hardships faced by families back home by censored letters that nonetheless included tidbits of truth. Water from broken pumps had to be carried by hand in Berlin. Women in Cologne traded valuable food rations for soap on the illicit market. In this context, the clean towels and camp showers came to represent inequality. They served as many people's first introduction to the scope of American wealth. What it disclosed about national priorities was what gave it its wider relevance. America's power enabled both, but Germany's industry had been focused nearly exclusively on the war machine. Aircraft and tanks streamed off assembly lines, but so did commonplace items. The infrastructure for cleaning, laundry facilities, and hygiene supplies persisted unabated. For the inmates, it was more than simply a matter of comfort. It was proof of a robust economy that could support both the home front and the battlefield without collapsing. The women adapted to the routines as the weeks stretched into months. Work responsibilities gave regularity, bathing routines became second nature, and inspections ceased to surprise. However, there was a lasting effect below this adaptation. Every day and without exception, America's cleanliness standards had come to represent a cultural gap they were unable to ignore. The difference was striking to many who had experienced the squalor and poverty of wartime Germany. As barracks fell into quietness in the nights, the weight of reflections increased. The conflict had been about more than just land and weaponry. It was also about the quality of life that a country could offer, even during its most dire times. The German ladies in captivity saw America's fixation on cleanliness as a sign of riches rather than just order. As these lessons became clear, the next revelation would go beyond cleaning requirements and touch on everyday meals and rations, each of which had a unique tale of contrast. The shock permeated the prohibited letters ink from the camp barracks. As we saw in the last chapter, many German captives were confused by plumbing and showers. These similar perceptions have crossed the Atlantic to reach families in a country still struggling with scarcity. The gap between two worlds was most apparent here, on brittle pieces of paper. Under stringent Allied regulations, all German prisoners were allowed to write letters. Every line of the content was thoroughly screened by censors who obscured any important information. The men and women in captivity, however, attempted to depict the strange realities of everyday life within those constrained parameters. They described spotless barracks with flush toilets and sinks for washing, as well as continuous hot showers and water that was always accessible. Such descriptions seemed almost fanciful to people who had grown up in communities where water was delivered by hand. Contrast intensified the shock. Families in Germany hardly had access to soap, much less a constant supply of hot water. Many communities had water lines damaged by Allied bombardment. Rationing affected every element of day-to-day living, and electricity frequently went out. Given that, it must have seemed less like a jail and more like an odd form of plenty to read of sons or brothers standing beneath constant streams of hot water. Some letters used cautious language to convey this odd feeling. A prisoner may comment that the facilities were unusual, or that hygiene was easier here. The authors avoided hyperbole, which is why such subtle statements have weight. The connotation was obvious, even within bounds. America had extra resources. The wealth of the enemy revealed a different kind of strength to men who had marched over Europe in the cause of conquest. Any mention to the sites or numbers of camps was censored, but these cultural parallels were allowed to remain. The Allies were aware that these kinds of messages may depress domestic German morale. Sometimes the families that got them didn't trust what they read. It seemed almost offensive to think of inmates taking daily baths while citizens waited in line for water in destroyed cities. Some people rejected the stories as propaganda that American officials had inserted. However, the letter's tone and handwriting were recognizable, bearing the imprint of loved ones. The Geneva Convention and the idea that kindness could weaken enemy determination served as the foundation for the U.S. Army's conscious policy of compassionate treatment. In actuality, it meant that inmates experienced unexpected conveniences. Camps were supplied with water from municipal systems, barracks were clean, and restrooms were operational. Those impressions were dispersed beyond the wire by the act of writing home. Reading by candlelight, German women found it difficult to make sense of such tales in the context of their everyday struggles with shortages. From a camp in Texas, a mother would question how her youngster might be less whiny than she was from her Hamburg kitchen. It hurt to be contradicted. It also emphasized the growing disparity between the industrial might of the United States and a disintegrating Reich. The writing of letters became a rite in the camps. Following roll call, inmates assembled and sat at wooden tables using paper that the officials had provided. They made an effort to give tidbits of life even though they knew their comments would be scrutinized. Many refrained from making straightforward remarks about politics or the course of the war. Rather, they talked about the food, the weather, and most importantly, the peculiar pleasure of taking regular baths. The mere act of washing every day felt remarkable enough to warrant attention to troops who had gone weeks without soap on the Eastern Front. The letters provided American censors with a rare glimpse into the prisoners' thoughts. The regular surprise over amenities and hygiene was mentioned in reports collected from this correspondence. Analysts realized that these cultural shocks exposed more than just the inmates' comfort. They also demonstrated their awareness of America's infrastructure as a covert weapon of mass destruction. Abundance and cleanliness represented the riches of an industrial democracy that had not been destroyed. Silently, the effects of these letters were felt. Various families responded with varying degrees of hesitant incredulity. envy, and covert animosity. Returning letters occasionally alluded to the resentment of people who rationed every last piece of bread, battled to stay warm, and were bombed. The psychological gap between suffering on the home front and prisoner life overseas was highlighted by the contrast. The letters turned into pieces of testimony as the war neared its conclusion in 1944 and 1945. They demonstrated how Germans were constantly reminded of their country's shortcomings, even while they were in captivity. In Europe, running water and showers, commonplace in America, became potent images when juxtaposed with debris and destruction. These impressions signaled the start of introspection for the inmates. In addition to providing families with information, their letters acknowledged a larger reality: that societies with wildly disparate capacities were fighting the war. And limitless supply of water from a tap came to symbolize the industrial river that propelled American triumph. These realizations mark the beginning of the new phase. What started out as surprise in private letters would quickly spread to the general public. Prisoners would experience yet another aspect of this plenty while working in American industries and fields, not just in terms of water and cleanliness but also in the equipment of daily living. The thoughts from those letters now shifted to recollection. In the final chapter, inmates wrote to their relatives to express their surprise. As seized women recalled the hardships they had previously faced inside the Wehrmacht, the parallels became more profound in this chapter. They found the relative order of confinement to be startling, if not unnerving, in contrast to frontline work. The memories of arduous marches and temporary hospitals were common among nurses who had served with field units in France, Italy, or Russia. Many had been billeted in tents set up close to the battle, or in cellars or barns. The state of hygiene was archaic. You might go weeks without a good bath. When fuel was available, water was cooked after being extracted from rivers or melted snow. There wasn't much soap. These women had strong scarcity habits when they were taken into captivity. But once they were inside American camps, they found a completely other world. Clean water was available every day from running taps. Hot showers were commonplace, occasionally planned to maintain order, but never refused. Many female inmates experienced psychological as well as bodily shock. They had been members of an army that claimed to rule Europe but was unable to provide its own medical personnel with the respect of hygiene. According to reports, German military nurses frequently treated the injured with crude tools while working in mud or dust. Sweat and filth stiffened their uniforms. They made do with rags, snow, or even sand to clean wounds when supply routes failed. Disease came next, and many recalled lice, typhus, and dysentery as ongoing dangers. On the other hand, regular hygiene was enforced in the American camps for both comfort and health reasons. American officials realized that cleanliness kept the peace, protected both guards and inmates, and decreased disease outbreaks. Scale exacerbated the shock. Even though a single POW camp could contain thousands of people, it nonetheless included functional laundry facilities, restrooms, and showers. Despite its reputation for efficiency, the Wehrmacht frequently failed to supply these necessities to its own frontline caregivers. The notion that prisoners in America enjoyed better living conditions than soldiers and personnel in an active German army was a sobering one for nurses who had been taken. Some women confessed in each other that they felt humiliated by the disparity. Openly admitting it would have been embarrassing, but in private discussions the truth came to light. They recalled drying themselves with ripped fabric, waiting in line for a single pail of cold water, or going weeks without soap in the field. They could now feel the cascade of warm water by turning a knob. There was no denying the abundance. The encounter strengthened the increasing awareness of America's industrial prowess. In the camps, running water was a result of infrastructure that permeated every aspect of life and was not just a luxury. Regardless of hostilities, water systems were in place in American cities, towns, and even rural places. This continuous availability demonstrated to Germans used to shortages the stark contrasts between the two countries' war preparations. The nurses had conflicting thoughts on their time spent serving throughout the war. On the one hand, they had given all to help the Wehrmacht. However, they now understood that their struggles had been caused by a system that was overburdened by ambition and conflict rather than being inevitable. Their pride was eaten away by the contrast. The acculturation of female inmates was significant to American officers monitoring the camps. In addition to protecting health, clean facilities represented justice. The U.S. Army made sure women were treated equally to males in terms of hygiene by strictly adhering to Geneva standards. Officials reported on the nurses' surprise in interviews and camp reports. Despite their simplicity, the accounts were powerful. They validated what letters and observations had already hinted at. America's infrastructure was just as strong as its military might. These insights had repercussions that went beyond personal shock. Long after the war ended, many inmates still remembered American institutions. Some brought with them an implicit analogy that influenced their perspective on Reconstruction when they returned to a defeated motherland. They had personally witnessed the importance of dependable water and sanitation in maintaining order, morale, and health. It was a subtle but lasting lesson. From a strategic standpoint, the disparity highlighted the enormous difference between American and German capabilities. While the United States gave its prisoners soap and showers, the Wehrmacht was unable to ensure adequate cleanliness, even for its nurses. That distinction went beyond mere symbolism. It demonstrated how the quiet power of infrastructure, rather than ideology or strategy, frequently served as the basis for triumph. The women adapted to the routines as they became accustomed to the cadence of camp life. However, they couldn't help but think of the muck and hardship of the front every time they entered a shower. No amount of propaganda could undo the cultural shock caused by the memories colliding with the present. This is not the end of the narrative. Inmates would eventually have to deal with more surprises than just cleanliness, devices and machinery that appeared to be imported from another planet. Large supermarkets, electric stoves, and washing machines were waiting for them to be found. The cultural parallels would deepen, transforming everyday existence into a sequence of epiphanies. The comparisons to German military conditions led naturally to a deeper realization. What prisoners at first regarded as mere conveniences, showers, sinks, and steady hot water, soon revealed a message more profound. In these ordinary routines of hygiene, America displayed something far greater than comfort. It showed the strength of a nation whose power extended beyond the battlefield, into the pipes, pumps, and infrastructure that sustained everyday life. For many German women held in captivity, the contrast was disorienting. They had served in an army that carried prestige and tradition, yet their memories were filled with scarcity. The Wehrmacht stretched across continents, but it could not guarantee its own nurses a wash after weeks in the field. Now, within camps built for enemy prisoners, water flowed freely and soap was available by the bar. This reality unsettled assumptions about superiority that propaganda had long reinforced. U.S. authorities understood this effect. To them, sanitation was not only a matter of health but of order. Camp reports emphasized regular bathing schedules, inspections of latrines, and the maintenance of plumbing systems that operated with the same discipline as a military unit. Behind these routines lay deliberate intent. By upholding standards of cleanliness, America conveyed that its industrial reach was so vast it could afford to provide even its captives with conditions better than many Allied or Axis frontline soldiers experienced. The infrastructure itself told a story. Pipes laid beneath the ground carried water in steady supply. Boilers ensured heat. Drainage systems disposed of waste with efficiency. These were not luxuries arranged for a single camp. They were the natural product of a society where cities and towns had developed reliable plumbing for decades. To German eyes, the systems seemed extraordinary. To Americans, they were ordinary, expected, and unremarkable. The silent message carried weight. In Germany, years of shortages had eroded living standards. Bombing raids damaged water lines and left families queuing for access to public pumps. Soap was rationed, often replaced with inferior substitutes. Even officers on campaign sometimes wrote of longing for a proper bath. Against that background, the abundance in captivity appeared almost unbelievable. The point did not need to be spoken aloud. The facilities themselves declared that America possessed resources that could outlast, outbuild, and ultimately overpower. Observers noted that the impact on morale was subtle but persistent. Prisoners adjusted quickly to new routines, but they carried within them the awareness of difference. Each turn of a faucet reminded them that their captor's nation enjoyed strength embedded in the most ordinary of functions. A shower was not simply a shower, it was a demonstration of capacity. In the broader picture of the war, this mattered. Industrial supremacy was not measured only in tanks or aircraft carriers, but in the invisible systems that kept a society functioning without collapse. Some reports suggested that American camp authorities consciously recognized this influence. The Geneva Conventions required certain standards, yet the consistency with which U.S. facilities exceeded them indicated a deeper purpose. Cleanliness reduced disease, maintained order, and reassured international observers. At the same time, it projected confidence. America could afford to treat its captives well because it was never threatened by shortage on the same scale as its enemies. The German women reflected on this in quiet moments. Their memories of muddy field stations stood in sharp contrast to the tiled walls of camp showers. Their recollections of ration cards and improvised soaps clashed with the simple abundance of supplies now handed out. They came to realize that infrastructure was more than comfort. It was power expressed in silence. No speeches were necessary, no boasting required. The message was in the water itself, clean, warm, and constant. Strategically, this formed part of a larger truth. The United States, shielded by oceans and fueled by vast resources, mobilized without the devastation suffered by other combatants. Its factories produced machines of war at unprecedented speed, but its pipelines, power grids, and waterworks continued to serve civilians and captives alike. This dual capacity, war production alongside civilian abundance, proved decisive. Where Germany strained to balance weapons with survival, America managed both. The consequences reached beyond immediate impressions. When the war ended, many of those who had lived through captivity returned to a Germany struggling with ruins and shortages. Memories of American camp facilities resurfaced as benchmarks of what was possible. The comparison influenced perspectives on reconstruction, reminding former prisoners that stability required not only factories and armies, but also reliable foundations of daily life. In the narrative of the war, modern plumbing seldom appears in headlines. Yet within the quiet corridors of POW camps, it played a symbolic role. It reminded captives that industrial power was not abstract. It was concrete, flowing through pipes, heating water, and sustaining order day after day. The message was delivered without words, yet it was heard clearly. As the war moved toward its end, this awareness prepared the ground for final reflections. For the prisoners, each shower became part of a broader realization that America's victory rested not only on weapons but on a society built to endure. In the next chapter, those reflections would widen to encompass the sea itself, where industrial power created carriers and fleets at a scale few could have imagined. From the previous chapter's accounts of plumbing as a quiet signal of power, the story now shifts toward something even more enduring. For the German women in captivity, the showers and bathing systems of America became not just daily routines, but haunting reminders of what had separated their nation from its enemy. The bridge between comfort and conquest was made of steel, pipes, and abundance. In the camps, water flowed without interruption. For those who had come from cities bombed into rubble and villages where wells had run dry, the endless streams seemed almost unreal. Some remembered how, in Germany, shortages had reached into every household. Fuel, food, and clothing had been rationed until nothing felt certain. Soap had been scarce, and bathing was often a weekly luxury. Now, under captivity, they stepped into facilities where hot water poured from polished pipes at the twist of a hand. The contrast struck with a force no lecture could match. For U.S. authorities, this was no accident. Hygiene was more than comfort. It was policy. Officials overseeing prisoner camps viewed cleanliness as both a health necessity and a reflection of national capacity. America had the resources to build not just barracks and fences, but tiled washrooms, heated showers, and plumbing that seemed to run without end. Where their own homes in Germany had been battered by scarcity, these women now saw that the United States could sustain modern living even in places meant for its enemies. The design of these systems underscored that reality. Across the continental camps, engineers installed large-scale water heaters, underground pipe networks, and shower blocks capable of serving hundreds at a time. Reports described how many German prisoners were startled not by guards with rifles, but by the scale of infrastructure supporting what appeared to be ordinary routines. The message was subtle yet profound. If America could spare such effort for prisoners, what force had it unleashed for its own armies? The war itself had already revealed the answer. U.S. industry had reached levels of production unmatched in modern history. Factories that once built automobiles now produced tanks, bombers, and ships in staggering numbers. Steel rolled out of American mills by the millions of tons, enough to pave over shortages that strangled Axis economies. The plumbing inside a camp was a small reflection of the same industrial tide. It symbolized capacity without limits, abundance carried into every corner of life. For the German women, the realization settled slowly. They had been taught that discipline, willpower, and unity could overcome material disadvantage. Yet here, in rows of showers that never seemed to run dry, stood the counterargument. This was not ideology but infrastructure. America's strength was measured not only in weapons but in pipes, heaters, and the steady pressure of running water. The showers became a lesson they could not ignore. Modernity itself had been weaponized. The shock was cultural as much as military. At home, families received letters hinting at these facilities, though censorship muted the details. Some reports suggested that mothers in ruined German towns found it impossible to believe that their daughters bathed daily in captivity. How could such abundance exist, when their own households boiled water over broken stoves and stretched soap for weeks? To them, the stories sounded like fantasy, even exaggeration. Yet for those inside the camps, the memory was concrete, steaming, and undeniable. This memory carried emotional weight far beyond hygiene. It sharpened the awareness that Germany's defeat was not only on the battlefield but in the foundations of modern living. Bombers and battleships could be explained as tools of war, but showers spoke of a deeper imbalance. They symbolized a society whose resources reached into every detail, where even enemies were touched by its abundance. That was the silent message. For the U.S. administration, the outcome was twofold. Practically, hygienic camps reduced disease and unrest. Symbolically, they displayed the nation's capability in ways no parade could equal. The prisoners themselves became witnesses to America's prosperity. When they were eventually released or exchanged, they carried home recollections not only of defeat but of overwhelming abundance. Those impressions lasted, shaping post-war memories and, for many, fueling a sense that the modern world was shifting irrevocably westward. The consequences stretched into the post-war years. Some of these women would later remember the showers as their first encounter with a superpower defined not just by armies but by industrial capacity. They returned to a homeland divided, scarred, and impoverished, where shortages persisted long after the fighting ceased. Against that backdrop, the recollection of endless water remained vivid, a symbol of what had been lost and what had been revealed. In the long view, such details became part of the historical record of captivity. Historians later noted that the infrastructure of American camps illustrated a wider truth. Victory in the Second World War had been built as much on production and logistics as on tactics and battles. The showers were not trivial. They were reminders that a nation capable of such abundance could not be outlasted by one defined by scarcity. As this chapter closes, the story of running water in captivity becomes more than a memory. It stands as a metaphor for the broader imbalance that shaped the war's outcome. And as the narrative moves forward, the reflections of these women will merge with wider accounts of what it meant to face a superpower whose strength lay not only in its soldiers, but in the very systems that sustained them.